The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and Edward Hartwell did not open it for 3 days. It sat on the corner of his writing desk, next to a half-empty ink pot and a photograph he no longer turned face up. The envelope was plain, sealed with ordinary wax, and carried the return address of the Transatlantic Matrimonial Agency in London. He knew what was inside. He had written to them himself, 6 weeks earlier. In a moment of quiet desperation, he had since chosen to pretend was simply practical reasoning. He had asked them to find him a wife. Edward was the 4th Duke of Ashmore, lord of a 300-year-old estate in Northumberland, England, and he was completely, thoroughly, and undeniably alone. The estate itself was not the problem. Ashmore Hall was a magnificent place, even in its current state of slow decline. It sat on 40 acres of moorland, with a stone facade that caught the morning light in a way that made painters want to set up their easels at the gate. Inside, the ceilings were high, the fireplaces were grand, and the corridors were long enough that a man could walk for 10 minutes and still be inside his own house. There were 14 bedrooms, a library with 3,000 books, a dining room that could seat 40, and a kitchen that had once fed an entire county during a harvest celebration. But in the autumn of 1889, only 6 of those rooms were in regular use. The dining room seated 1, the kitchen fed a household staff of 8, who went about their duties quietly and carefully, the way people do when they have learned that silence is the safest language in a particular house. Edward was 38 years old. He had brown hair that had begun to go gray at the temples, and gray eyes that people frequently described as unreadable. He was tall and carried himself with the kind of posture that comes not from confidence, but from years of being told to stand straight. He was not unkind, but he had forgotten, somewhere along the way, how to be warm. He ran the estate with discipline and efficiency. He met his obligations to his tenants. He attended the required social functions in the county, and spoke only when spoken to, and even then, only as much as was necessary. He had been this way for 7 years, since the winter of 1882, when his wife Margaret had gone into labor with their first child, and neither she nor the child had come back out of that room alive. He did not talk about Margaret. He did not allow her name to be spoken in the house. The east wing, which had been her favorite part of the building, remained locked. He had placed the key in a drawer in his study, and had not opened that drawer since the spring of 1883. The staff knew better than to ask. His estate manager, a practical and loyal man named George Alderton, had gently raised the subject of remarriage twice in 7 years, and both times Edward had ended the conversation with a single look. But George had raised it a 3rd time in September of 1889, and this time he had brought numbers with him. The estate was losing money. Not catastrophically, not yet, but steadily. The north pastures needed drainage work that would cost more than a season's income. The roof of the west wing had been repaired twice in 4 years, and would need full replacement before the next winter. 2 of their tenant farms had gone unoccupied for 18 months after the previous families had moved to the city, and finding new tenants required investments in repairs that the estate accounts could not comfortably support. George had laid all of this out on the desk in front of Edward, with the careful manner of a man who knows he is delivering unwelcome news to someone who does not enjoy being surprised. "The estate needs capital," George said, "and the most direct route to capital, for a man of your position, is marriage to a woman of means." Edward had stared at the numbers for a long time. "I am not interested in being sold to the highest bidder," he said. "No one suggested that," George replied. "But there are women of good character and adequate fortune who would benefit from a title and a position, and you would benefit from the practical security. It need not be anything more complicated than that." Edward had said nothing more that afternoon, but the next morning he had written to the agency. The letter he asked them to send him was meant to be simple. He wanted a woman of moderate means, ideally between 25 and 35, who was sensible, composed, and capable of managing a household. He specified that he was not looking for romance or sentiment. He was looking for a practical partnership. He asked the agency to be very clear about this with any candidate they approached. What he did not know, as that envelope sat unopened on his desk for 3 days, was that the agency had found exactly one woman willing to accept those terms, and that she had accepted them for reasons that had very little to do with what he was offering, and very much to do with what she was escaping. He opened the letter on a Thursday evening, after supper, when the house was quiet and the fire in his study had burned down to low orange coals. He read it twice. The agency had found a match. Her name was Clara Voss. She was 29 years old. She was American, from New York City. She had been a school teacher. She was, according to the agency, a woman of strong character and practical intelligence, with sufficient personal savings to demonstrate financial responsibility and a sincere desire to establish a settled life in England. Edward read the phrase strong character and paused on it for a moment. He was not entirely sure what it meant. He told himself it probably meant she was capable and reliable. He wrote back to the agency the following morning and told them to proceed. He did not ask for more details. He did not ask for a photograph. He did not ask what she looked like, or what she enjoyed, or what kind of life she had been living in New York. He asked only one question: when could she arrive? The agency replied within the week. Clara Voss had already agreed to the arrangement. She had already booked her passage. She would arrive at Ashmore Hall on the 14th of November, which was 5 weeks away. Edward read that letter, set it aside, and went back to reviewing the estate accounts. But something had changed in the house, even if only slightly. The staff noticed it first, the way staff always do. Mrs. Dora Ellison, who had been the housekeeper at Ashmore Hall for 19 years, observed that the Duke seemed to spend slightly more time walking the grounds in the mornings than he had before. She also noticed that he had asked George Alderton to have 2 of the guest rooms aired out and cleaned, which had not been done in some years. She said nothing about any of this, but she quietly instructed the kitchen staff to ensure the larder was properly stocked, and she personally went through the linen cupboards to assess what would need replacing. The other staff members processed the news of the incoming Duchess in their own ways. Owen Paris, the groundskeeper, a quiet man of 50, who had worked at Ashmore since he was a young man, simply nodded when George told him, and went back to trimming the hedge near the east gate. Nora Finch, the youngest housemaid, who was 18 and had been at the hall for only 8 months, asked 3 questions in rapid succession and was gently told by Mrs. Ellison to focus on her duties. The weeks leading up to Clara's arrival passed with a kind of held breath over the estate. Edward continued his routines. He reviewed accounts. He met with his tenants. He attended a dinner at a neighboring estate and spoke very little. He slept in the same room he had slept in for 30 years, in a bed that felt too large, and woke before dawn, the way he always did, and sat in the dark for a few minutes the way he always did, before rising and beginning the day. He told himself, repeatedly, that this was a business arrangement and nothing more. The woman was coming to serve a function. She would manage the household. She would provide the estate with the financial benefit that came from a respectable marriage. She would attend social functions at his side. She would, in time, provide an heir, which was a practical necessity he thought about with the detachment of someone reviewing a legal document rather than contemplating anything personal. He had convinced himself that he had thought through every element of this arrangement carefully. He was the Duke of Ashmore. He had been managing complex situations his entire adult life. He knew what he was doing. On the 13th of November, the evening before Clara was due to arrive, Edward sat in his study and looked at the fire for a long time. He was not nervous. He was not anxious. He was simply, quietly, aware that tomorrow something would be different. He picked up a pen and pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward him, intending to draft some notes for the following week's accounts review. He sat with the pen in his hand for several minutes. He did not write anything. He put the pen down. He looked at the fire again. He went to bed earlier than usual that night, which Mrs. Ellison noted with interest when she saw that his study light had gone out before 10 o'clock. What Edward Hartwell did not know, as he lay in the dark of his large and silent room, was that the woman arriving tomorrow was nothing at all like what the agency had described. He had read the phrase strong character and thought it meant reliable. He would discover, very quickly, that it meant something else entirely. Clara Voss had not come to England to be manageable. She had come because she had run out of other options, and because she was the kind of woman who, when she runs out of other options, finds a way to make the situation work on her own terms. She had read the Duke's requirements in the agency's letter, the request for composure and obedience and agreeableness, and she had found it almost amusing. She had agreed to the arrangement because it offered her a way forward. She had not, for even one moment, agreed to become someone she was not. The morning of the 14th of November arrived gray and cold, with a low sky and a wind coming off the moors that pulled at the coats of anyone standing outside. Edward stood in the doorway of Ashmore Hall and watched the carriage come up the long gravel drive. He stood very straight. His expression was composed. He was, as always, entirely in control. The carriage stopped, the door opened, and the woman who stepped out was carrying two heavy trunks, a wooden crate she had clearly packed herself, and an expression on her face that suggested she had been traveling for 3 weeks and found the journey unremarkable. She looked up at the house first, then at Edward. "You must be the Duke," she said, and her American accent was clear and warm, with a directness in it that was not rude, but was also not deferential. "I am," Edward said. "And you are Miss Voss." "Clara," she said, and walked past him into the house. Edward turned and watched her go inside. He stood in the doorway for one more moment, the cold wind at his back, and experienced something he had not felt in a very long time. He was not entirely sure what it was. It felt, uncomfortably, like the beginning of something he had not prepared for. He walked inside and closed the door. Behind him, on the drive, Owen Paris collected the luggage from the carriage, looked at the crate of books, and quietly said nothing at all. Inside Ashmore Hall, Clara Voss stood in the entrance hall and looked up at the ceiling, which was 20 feet high, and painted with a faded mural of clouds and figures in blue and gold. She looked at the dark wood paneling on the walls, the cold stone floor, the two large paintings of men in military uniform, who stared down with the same expression the Duke had just used on her. She looked at all of it, and then she looked at the sheet of paper that the Duke had quietly handed her as she passed him in the doorway. She unfolded it. It was a printed list. At the top, in careful handwriting, it read, "Expected conduct and duties of the Duchess of Ashmore." Clara read every item on the list. It took about 2 minutes. Then she folded the paper neatly, looked around for somewhere to put it, and placed it on the small side table near the door, with the same care one might use to set down something that had been handed to them by mistake. "I will take this under consideration," she said pleasantly. Edward looked at the paper on the side table. Then he looked at Clara. In 23 years of running Ashmore Hall, no one had ever put his instructions on a side table. He opened his mouth. Then he closed it again. Clara was already asking Mrs. Ellison to show her where the kitchen was. Edward stood alone in the entrance hall of his own home, the paper sitting on the table beside him, and felt the ground shift slightly beneath his feet, in a way that had nothing to do with the building. Above him, the painted figures in the ceiling mural continued to stare at clouds, serene and indifferent, as they had for 200 years. Outside, the wind came off the moors and moved through the bare trees at the edge of the property, with a sound like quiet conversation. Something had come to Ashmore Hall, and nothing, though Edward did not yet fully understand this, was going to be quite the same. Clara Voss did not sleep well on her first night at Ashmore Hall. This had nothing to do with the bed, which was large and firm and covered in linen that smelled faintly of lavender. It had nothing to do with the cold, though the room was certainly cold, the kind of deep stone cold that English country houses seem to hold inside their walls regardless of what fires are lit. It had nothing to do with noise, because Ashmore Hall at night was so profoundly quiet that Clara, who had spent her entire life in New York City and was accustomed to the sound of the streets below her window at all hours, found the silence almost physical, like a pressure in her ears. She did not sleep well because she was thinking too hard, and Clara had never been able to stop thinking just because the hour required it. She lay on her back and stared at the ceiling of her room and went over the day in careful detail, the way she always processed new experiences, turning each moment over and examining it from different angles. She had arrived, she had seen the house, she had met the Duke, she had placed his list of rules on a side table and watched his expression do something very interesting, something that was not quite anger and not quite surprise, but was some uncomfortable combination of both. She had toured the house with Mrs. Ellison, the housekeeper, who was a compact woman, of perhaps 60, with very tidy gray hair, and the manner of someone who had learned to be efficient with her feelings. Mrs. Ellison had shown her the rooms she would have access to, the drawing room, the morning room, the dining room, her own bedroom and adjoining sitting room, the library, and the ground floor of the East Wing, which had been described only as not currently in use. Clara had noticed the door at the far end of the East Wing corridor was not just closed, but locked, with no key visible in the lock. She had said nothing about it, but she had noted it. She had eaten dinner in the large dining room, while Edward ate at the opposite end of the same table, 20 feet away, in a silence so complete that Clara could hear the clock on the mantelpiece. A footman named Percy, a young man of perhaps 22, who moved with the careful precision of someone very keen not to make a mistake, had served them both without speaking. Clara had glanced down the length of the table at Edward twice. Both times, he had been looking at his plate. After dinner, Edward had excused himself to his study. Clara had gone to the library. The library was the first room in Ashmore Hall that had made her feel anything close to comfortable. It was large and smelled of old paper and wood polish, and the shelves went from floor to ceiling on 3 walls, with a rolling ladder on a brass rail that Clara had immediately wanted to test. She had not tested it on the first evening. She had simply walked along the shelves, reading the spines, noting what was there and what was not, the way a person takes stock of a new place by understanding what it contains. There was a great deal of history, law, estate management, natural philosophy, some classical literature, very little fiction, almost no poetry, not a single book that looked as though it had been read for pleasure rather than reference. Clara had stood in front of those shelves for a long time. She had brought her own books, of course. They were still in the crate she had carried from New York, sitting in the corner of her room. She had packed them last, and would unpack them first, because wherever her books were, was wherever she felt most settled. Now she lay in the dark and thought about the Duke. Edward Hartwell was not what she had expected. She had prepared herself, on the long voyage across the Atlantic, to meet a man who was either coldly indifferent or aggressively controlling. She had prepared arguments and strategies. She had decided in advance that she would be pleasant, but firm, cooperative, but never submissive. She had rehearsed, in the quiet of the ship's cabin, certain sentences she might need to say. What she had not prepared for was a man who seemed, beneath the rigid surface, to be in some kind of pain that he had been carrying for so long he had forgotten it was there. She had seen it in the entrance hall, in that brief moment when she put his list of rules on the side table. Most people, when challenged, became louder. They expanded. They asserted themselves more forcefully. Edward had done the opposite. He had contracted slightly, like something that had been pressed. There was no anger in his face. There was something quieter than anger, something that looked, for just a second, like a man who had been expecting this without knowing he was expecting it. Clara was good at reading people. She had spent 8 years in front of a classroom of children, and children were the most honest audience in the world. They could not hide boredom or confusion or discomfort, and learning to read those signals quickly had trained Clara to notice the same things in adults who were simply better at pretending. The Duke was pretending a great deal. She turned onto her side and looked at the dark window. The curtains were heavy and let in almost no light from outside. She could hear the wind moving across the moors, low and steady, a sound that was foreign to her, but not unpleasant. She thought about New York. Her apartment had been 2 small rooms above a laundry on the Lower East Side of the city, noisy and warm, and always smelling of soap from downstairs. She had lived there for 4 years, since she left the school in Brooklyn, where she had taught for 3 years before being dismissed. The dismissal had not been her fault, or rather, it had been entirely her doing, but she did not consider herself at fault for it. The school's headmaster, a man named Cornelius Bright, had decided to remove all books about the natural world from the curriculum, replacing them with a strictly religious framework that Clara found deeply inadequate for the children she was teaching. She had said so, in a staff meeting, in front of all her colleagues. Cornelius Bright had given her one warning. She had continued teaching from the books she considered appropriate. He had dismissed her at the end of the term. She had found another teaching position within 2 months. Then that school had been acquired by a trust with connections to Cornelius Bright, and she had been quietly not rehired for the following year. She had taken private tutoring work. She had written articles for 2 educational journals under a pen name, because women writing under their own names were not taken seriously in those publications. She had made enough to live on, but not enough to build anything, not enough to feel settled. Her aunt, Millicent Voss, a practical woman who had been widowed young and had built a small but stable life for herself through careful decisions, had been the one to show her the agency's advertisement. A Duke, Millicent had said, with the careful tone of someone offering something they know might be rejected. Clara had looked at the advertisement. She had read it slowly. A man of title and property in England, seeking a woman of sensible character for a practical marriage. No mention of love, no mention of affection. Just a clear statement of what was wanted and what was offered in return. She had felt something odd reading it. Not romance, not hope. Something more pragmatic than either of those things. A kind of recognition. Here was a person being honest about what they needed. Here was an arrangement that did not pretend to be something it was not. She had spent years dealing with people who pretended. Who said one thing and meant another. Who dressed control up as care and called dismissal a mutual decision. The bluntness of the Duke's advertisement was, in a strange way, the most refreshing thing she had read in years. She had written her reply the same afternoon. She had been careful with her words. She described herself accurately, but strategically. She mentioned her teaching experience. She mentioned her savings, which were modest but genuine. She described herself as practical and direct, which was true. She did not describe herself as difficult, which she knew people considered her, because it was not the word she would have used. She was not difficult. She simply had standards, and was not willing to lower them, because someone found them inconvenient. The agency's response had come quickly. The Duke had agreed. Passage would be arranged. She would travel to England, and arrive at Ashmore Hall on the 14th of November. She had packed her life into 2 trunks and a crate of books, and crossed an ocean, and now, she was lying in the dark in a room, in a house, that felt like it had been built by people who believed silence was the same thing as peace. She sat up. She was not going to lie there going over everything in her head all night. That was not how she operated. When her mind would not stop, she gave it something purposeful to do. She lit the candle on the bedside table, got out of bed, wrapped a thick shawl around her shoulders, and opened the crate of books. She unpacked them methodically, stacking them on the floor beside the window. There were 32 of them. She arranged them in a rough order on the windowsill and the small writing desk in the corner. When the crate was empty, she stood back and looked at her books arranged in her new room, and she felt something settle slightly inside her. She picked up one of the books, a collection of essays on education and moral philosophy that she had read so many times the spine was soft, and she sat in the chair by the window and read until the candle burned low. When she finally went back to bed, she slept. She woke early, before the house stirred. She dressed herself without calling for anyone and went downstairs. The corridors were dim and cold, the morning light just beginning to come in through the tall windows at the end of the east wing. She found her way to the kitchen, which was in the lower ground floor, and was already warm, because the cook, a broad woman named Agnes Park, arrived before dawn. Agnes looked up when Clara came through the kitchen door, clearly surprised. "Good morning," Clara said. "I hope I am not in your way. I could not sleep, and I thought I would find where the tea was." Agnes stared at her for a moment. In her 30 years of working in large houses, she had never had a member of the family walk into her kitchen and ask where the tea was. "Sit down then," Agnes said, after a pause, and pointed at a chair near the stove. Clara sat down. Agnes made tea without further comment. They sat in a companionable silence for a few minutes, the warmth of the stove filling the room, the morning light slowly growing in the small window above the sink. "What is on the south field?" Clara asked, looking at the window. "The land beyond the formal garden. I could see it from my room." Agnes blinked. "That is the old kitchen garden. Been fallow for 5 years or so. Used to grow vegetables for the house, but it was let go after." Agnes stopped. Clara did not push. She looked at her tea. "It is good land," Agnes said, after a moment. "A shame to leave it." "It is a shame," Clara agreed quietly. They sat in silence for another minute. "The household staff eat breakfast together here, in this kitchen," Agnes said, "at 6:30. "I know," Clara said. "I will join you, if that is all right." Agnes looked at her again, then she nodded once, slowly, and went back to the stove. Upstairs, in the long corridors of Ashmore Hall, Mrs. Ellison was already making her morning rounds, checking that fires had been laid and rooms were in order. She passed the door of the room she had prepared for Clara, and noticed, with interest, that the door was open and the room was empty. She went to the window at the end of the corridor and looked down into the kitchen yard below. Through the small kitchen window, she could see 2 figures sitting near the stove. One was Agnes Park, who had worked at this estate for 30 years, and who, in that time, had never once invited anyone from the main house to sit in her kitchen. The other was the new American woman, sitting with a cup of tea, looking entirely at ease. Mrs. Ellison stood at the window for a moment. Then she allowed herself a very small, very quiet expression that might, in a different face, have been a smile. She went on with her rounds. At the other end of the house, Edward Hartwell had been awake since before dawn, as he always was. He sat at his desk with a cup of coffee and the morning's correspondence. He had not thought about the list of rules sitting on the side table in the entrance hall. He had, in fact, thought about it quite a lot, but he had decided he was not thinking about it. He was thinking about the estate accounts. He was thinking about the north pasture drainage. He was thinking about whether the south tenant farm could be made habitable before spring. He was absolutely not thinking about the American woman who had arrived at his door the previous day and set his carefully prepared instructions aside with the casual calm of someone reorganizing a shelf. He pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward him and began writing notes for his meeting with George Alderton later that morning. He wrote 3 sentences, then he stopped. He put the pen down. He looked at the fire. He thought, with unwilling clarity, that if someone had placed his list of household rules on a side table with that kind of composed certainty, they were either remarkably confident or had spent a long time refusing to be diminished by other people's expectations. He picked the pen back up. He wrote 2 more sentences. He put it down again. Outside, the moors were pale gray under an early sky, and somewhere in the house below him, a door opened and closed, and the day began. The first 2 weeks of Clara's life at Ashmore Hall were a study in quiet friction. Nothing exploded. Nothing broke. But the air in the house had a charge to it, like the feeling before a storm, when the sky goes very still and the birds stop making noise. It began with small things. On Clara's 3rd morning at the hall, Mrs. Ellison arrived at her room with the day's schedule, which Edward had maintained for the household for some years, a printed timetable indicating the times for meals, the hours during which the main rooms would be cleaned and therefore unavailable, and a notation that the Duke took his morning walk at 7 and that the south lawn should be considered private during that hour. Clara read the schedule politely. "Thank you, Mrs. Ellison," she said. "This is very helpful." She then asked whether there was a set time for the household staff to receive their weekly wages, because she had noticed in the kitchen that morning that Owen Paris, the groundskeeper, had mentioned something about a wage dispute from the previous quarter that had not yet been resolved, and she thought it ought to be addressed. Mrs. Ellison looked at her carefully. "Wage matters go through Mr. Alderton, the estate manager," she said. "Of course," Clara said. "I will speak with him today." "The Duke handles all estate business through Mr. Alderton directly," Mrs. Ellison said, with a delicate precision that conveyed several layers of meaning at once. "Then I will let Mr. Alderton know I would like a meeting," Clara said pleasantly, "and he can decide whether to bring it to the Duke." She had the meeting with George Alderton that afternoon. George was a man of perhaps 55, with a methodical manner and the careful eyes of someone who had learned to navigate the space between practicality and deference. He listened to Clara with the attentive patience of a man who was not yet sure what category she belonged in. "The groundskeeper's back wages," Clara said, 3 months outstanding, and the young housemaid, Nora, has been working an extra half-day each week, since September, without any adjustment to her pay. I would like both of those sorted this week." George looked at her. "The Duke manages those decisions," he said. "Then please bring them to the Duke," Clara said. "Today, if possible." There was a pause. "How do you know about the maid's extra hours?" George asked. "She mentioned it in passing," Clara said. "She was not complaining. She was simply answering a question I asked her. I asked her what her weekly duties involved." George was quiet for a moment. "You asked the housemaid about her duties." "I ask everyone about their duties," Clara said. "I find it is the fastest way to understand how a place actually operates." George did not respond immediately. He wrote something in the small notebook he always carried. Then he looked up. "I will speak with the Duke." The wages were settled by the end of the week. Edward had approved the payment without comment, but George noticed that the Duke had asked, in passing, how Clara had come to know about the outstanding amounts. George told him. Edward had said nothing further. But that was not the end of it. On the 7th day, Clara rearranged the library. This was perhaps the act that produced the most visible reaction. She had spent 2 evenings going through the shelves and had found the existing system, books ordered by acquisition date, which meant a volume purchased in 1841 sat next to one from 1879 regardless of subject, deeply impractical for anyone who actually wanted to find something. She had reorganized everything by subject, then alphabetically by author within each subject. The process took most of one afternoon and evening. She had enlisted Percy, the young footman, who had been nervous about it, but had become gradually more enthusiastic as the system began to take shape, and who had admitted, toward the end of the evening, that he sometimes tried to read in the library in his spare time, but could never find what he was looking for. "Now you will be able to," Clara said. She showed him the system. He understood it immediately. When Edward came to the library the following morning, he stood in the doorway and looked at his shelves. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, very evenly, "You have moved my books." Clara looked up from the desk where she was reading. "I have reorganized them," she said, "by subject and author. I can show you the system if you would like. It will be much easier to find anything now." "I knew exactly where everything was," Edward said. "You knew where they had been placed when they were purchased," Clara said, "which is a different thing." Edward looked at her. The same thing happened in his expression that had happened in the entrance hall on the first day, that slight contraction, that compressed quality, as though he was pressing something down. "Please do not rearrange my household without informing me," he said. "Of course," Clara said. "I will let you know in advance next time." Edward noticed, with some irritation, that she had agreed with him, without conceding the point. He went to the shelf nearest the door and looked for the volume he had come to find, a legal reference on estate entailment that had been kept in the third shelf on the left side. He looked at the third shelf. It was now natural history. He turned to Clara. She had already gone back to her reading. "Where is the legal reference section?" he asked. "Far right wall, second shelf from the top," she said, without looking up. He found the book. He took it and left. That evening, Percy mentioned to Nora Finch that the Duke had stayed in the library for 40 minutes after retrieving his book and had, at one point, been observed running a hand along a row of newly organized volumes with an expression that Percy could not quite interpret. Nora said that she thought that sounded like the Duke might be interested in the new system, even if he had not said so. Percy agreed, and added that he had helped organize the library, and that it was, genuinely, a much better system than before. In the kitchen that evening, Agnes Park made a stew that was, by anyone's assessment, slightly more elaborate than a regular Tuesday stew. She did not explain why. She simply served it, and Clara, who was eating in the kitchen because the silence of the formal dining room with Edward 20 feet away was something she was still deciding how to handle, said that it was the best stew she had eaten since leaving New York. Agnes said nothing, but she served her a second portion without being asked. On the 9th day, Clara broke the rule about the south lawn. This was not intentional. She genuinely did not remember, on that particular morning, that 7 o'clock was the Duke's private walking hour. She had woken early, found the morning gray and cold but dry, and had gone outside with a shawl and her notebook because she wanted to see the fallow south kitchen garden in daylight. She had walked around the edge of the formal garden and past the low stone wall, and was standing in the middle of what had clearly once been a productive vegetable garden, looking at the raised beds now thick with weeds, making notes about what the soil looked like and what might be done with it, when she heard footsteps on the gravel path behind her. She turned. Edward was standing at the edge of the garden, in his coat and hat, clearly in the middle of his morning walk, looking at her, with the expression of someone who has found a thing where a thing should not be. "Good morning," Clara said. "The south lawn is private at this hour," Edward said. "I know," Clara said. "I forgot. I am sorry. I was looking at the kitchen garden." There was a pause. Edward looked at the overgrown beds. His expression was difficult to read. "It has not been worked in 5 years," he said. It was a statement, not an invitation. "It is good soil," Clara said. Agnes mentioned the same thing. If it were cleared and turned over in the spring, it could supply most of the kitchen's vegetables by summer. That would reduce the household's food costs considerably. Edward looked at her. "You have been discussing household costs with my cook." "We talk in the mornings," Clara said. "She is very knowledgeable about how the house runs." That is not your area of responsibility, Edward said. You brought me here to help run this household, Clara said. I am trying to understand it. That requires talking to the people who run it. It requires talking to me, Edward said. I would be glad to talk to you, Clara said. You leave the table before I have finished my tea, and I do not see you again until the following morning. The silence that followed this observation lasted several seconds. The wind moved across the garden. A crow called somewhere beyond the stone wall. Edward looked at the kitchen garden again. His jaw was tight. His hands, Clara noticed, were clasped behind his back with a tension that looked like effort. I will have George look into the cost of clearing the beds, he said. Then he turned and walked back the way he had come. Clara watched him go. She stood in the kitchen garden for another few minutes, making her notes, the wind pulling at her shawl. What she had said about wanting to talk to him was true, but it was also more complicated than that. She had come to this place prepared to be self-sufficient, to make her own space and her own way regardless of whether the man she had married helped or hindered her. She had expected indifference. She had expected a man who handed her a list of rules and walked away. She had not expected, quite so quickly, to find herself curious about him. There was something underneath the coldness. She was sure of it. The locked east wing. The way the staff moved around certain silences, with the careful precision of people who had learned exactly where the edges were. The way Edward had stood in the kitchen garden just now, looking at the overgrown beds with an expression she could not name. She closed her notebook and went back inside. That afternoon, she found Mrs. Ellison and asked her, carefully and without pressure, whether there was anything she should know about the history of the house that would help her settle in. She chose her words precisely. Not asking about the East Wing, not asking about the first wife, just asking in general terms for context. Mrs. Ellison was quiet for a moment. Then she said, The Duke values order because he has had occasions to understand what happens when it is lost. He is not a cruel man, he is a careful one. It was less than Clara had hoped for, and more than she had expected. She thanked Mrs. Ellison and did not ask again. That evening, at dinner, she and Edward sat at their usual positions at the long table. Percy served in his usual quiet silence. Clara picked up her fork, and then, on some instinct she did not fully analyze, she said, I was reading about the drainage methods used on moorland estates in the north this afternoon. There is a technique that seems to have worked very well for properties with the same soil composition as your north pasture. Edward looked up from his plate. If you are interested, Clara added, I could leave the article on your desk. A pause. Yes, Edward said. You could do that. Clara ate her soup. Edward ate his soup. Between them, across 20 feet of polished table, the silence had a very slightly different quality than it had before. Neither of them said anything about it, but neither of them was unaware of it either. The article on drainage methods was on Edward's desk the following morning. He read it that afternoon, alone in his study, with the kind of attention he gave to things that were actually useful. It was a well-researched piece, copied out in Clara's clear handwriting, with 3 annotations in the margin, pointing to the specific passages most relevant to the North Pasture's conditions. One margin note read, See also the piece by the Agricultural Society of Northumberland, from 1885, which George Alderton may already have. Edward read the annotations twice, then he put the article in his desk drawer and went to find George. The drainage issue in the North Pasture, Edward said. I would like to revisit the cost estimates. Of course, George said. And pull the Agricultural Society report from 1885, if we have it. George looked at the article Edward was holding. He recognized Clara's handwriting. He said nothing about it. I will find it today, he said. This was how things worked in the weeks that followed. The friction did not disappear. If anything, it sharpened into something more specific. But the disagreements began to have a different quality. They were no longer the blunt collision of a man issuing instructions and a woman declining to follow them. They became, gradually, conversations. Not comfortable ones, not warm ones, but real ones. Clara asked questions that Edward found difficult to answer without thinking. He gave answers that she found, often, more reasonable than she had expected. She pushed back when she disagreed, and he did something that surprised her more than anything else. Occasionally, he conceded. Not grandly, not with any acknowledgement that she had made a good point. He simply, the following day, would do things the way she had suggested, as though it had been his decision all along. The wages were sorted. The kitchen garden was cleared and turned over in preparation for spring planting. A guest room on the second floor that had been used as a storage room for broken furniture was cleared, and the furniture repaired or discarded, which Clara had suggested after discovering that 2 of the younger household staff were sleeping in inadequate rooms at the top of the house, because better ones were considered unused while full of broken chairs. Each of these changes cost something, either money or Edward's comfort with things being different than they had been. But each of them, Clara noticed, he allowed. He grumbled at the margins. He used George as a buffer more often than was strictly necessary, but he allowed them. What he did not allow, and where Clara found herself hitting a genuine wall, was any conversation about the East Wing. She had not asked about it directly. She had made one attempt to approach it indirectly, mentioning to Mrs. Ellison that the corridor leading to it seemed to be letting in a draft, and asking whether the windows at that end of the building had been checked recently. Mrs. Ellison had said the East Wing was not in use and was maintained separately, and that any concerns about that corridor should be directed to Mr. Alderton. The response was polite, complete, and entirely closed. But the East Wing sat at the edge of Clara's awareness like an unresolved sentence. Ashmore Hall was beginning to feel like a place she understood, slowly, imperfectly, but with growing clarity. The East Wing was the part of it she could not read, and Clara was not accustomed to things she could not read. It was on the 19th day that she first saw Edward at the locked door. She had not been able to sleep, which had become a pattern on nights when she had too many thoughts that would not settle. She wrapped herself in her heavy shawl and left her room sometime past midnight, intending to go to the library. The East Wing corridor was on her route, separated from the main corridor by a short connecting passage. She had walked through this connecting passage before, but always in daylight. At night, the corridor was very dark, lit only by the thin gray light coming from a window at the far end. As Clara turned the corner, she stopped. Edward was sitting in a chair outside the locked door at the end of the East Wing, not standing, sitting, in a wooden chair that had clearly been placed there deliberately, because the hallway furniture was otherwise decorative pieces that no one actually used. He was in his dressing gown, not his usual composed daytime presentation, and he was holding a glass in one hand and looking at the locked door, with an expression that Clara saw for only a second, before she registered that she should not be seeing it at all. It was an expression of grief, pure, private, unguarded grief, the kind of face a person only makes when they are certain no one is watching. She took one step backward, around the corner, out of his line of sight. She stood in the connecting passage for several seconds, her back against the wall, the silence of the house pressing in. She did not go to the library. She went back to her room. She sat in her chair by the window for a long time. She had known, in a general way, that there was grief somewhere in this house. Mrs. Ellison's careful words, the way the staff navigated certain silences, the locked door itself. She had built a shape around that knowledge in her mind, a shape that was compassionate but abstract. What she had seen in the corridor was not abstract. It was a man sitting outside a locked door at midnight with a glass in his hand, alone in his own house, in the dark, looking at the place where something had happened that he still had not found a way to survive. Clara sat by her window until the sky outside began to lighten at the edges. When she went downstairs in the morning, she did what she always did. She went to the kitchen. She sat near the stove. Agnes made tea. She did not say anything about what she had seen. She would not say anything about it. It was not hers to speak about. But something had changed in how she thought about the man at the other end of the dining table. Not softer, exactly. Clara's thinking did not soften easily, but it had shifted. The conversation she was having in her mind about Edward Hartwell was no longer primarily about what he was blocking her from doing. It had become something more complicated and more patient than that. She thought about what Mrs. Ellison had said. He is not a cruel man. He is a careful one. She thought about someone building a life of order around a loss so complete that the room connected to it had to be locked, and the key put away, and the corridor avoided for 7 years, because otherwise it was just too much. She thought about how she had built her own smaller versions of the same thing. The teaching position she refused to think about too carefully, because the memory of that dismissal letter still made something tight move through her chest. The city she had left, because staying in it felt like repeating an argument she had already lost. She finished her tea. She asked Agnes if there was anything that needed doing in the kitchen that she could help with before the day started. Agnes looked at her for a long moment. Then she handed her a bowl of apples that needed peeling. Clara sat at the kitchen table and peeled apples while Agnes worked at the stove, and the morning light came in through the small window above the sink, and outside the wind moved across the moors in the way it always did, low and constant and indifferent to everything. Later that day, when Edward came to the library and found Clara at the desk, he stopped at the door, with the particular hesitation she had begun to recognize. He had something to say that he had not rehearsed. "The drainage article you left," he said. "It was useful. George and I are moving forward with the North Pasture Plan." Clara looked up. "Good," she said. "The spring timing is right." A pause. "You know about land drainage?" he asked. "I grew up in a city," she said. "But I read, and I spent 3 summers at my uncle's farm in Connecticut, which had significant drainage problems he was always arguing with his neighbors about. He usually won. He had better soil maps." Something passed across Edward's face. It was not quite a smile, but it was in the same neighborhood. He went to the shelves and found the book he was looking for, without difficulty. He was at the door to leave when she spoke again. "The apple tart Agnes made this afternoon," she said. "It was very good. I think it is the best thing I have eaten since I arrived." He turned. He looked at her. She was already reading again, her eyes on the page. "Agnes has been making that tart since before I was born," he said. "Her mother made it, her grandmother before her." "You should tell her that," Clara said, "that you remember it that way." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that has something in it. "I will," Edward said. He left. Clara turned a page. Outside, the afternoon was getting dark, the autumn coming down quickly the way it did in the north. In the kitchen, Agnes Park took the second apple tart out of the oven and set it on the rack to cool, and did not particularly wonder why she had made 2 of them, because some things you simply do, and the reasons come later if they come at all. The storm arrived on the 2nd of December, and it arrived without much warning. There had been a gray sky all day, the kind that sits low and flat over moorland, and makes everything beneath it feel compressed. The temperature had dropped sharply through the afternoon. Owen Paris had spent the morning securing things in the yard and the outbuildings with the quiet efficiency of a man who has known this particular kind of weather for 50 years and does not need anyone to tell him what it is preparing to do. By the time dinner was finished at Ashmore Hall, the wind had picked up to a level that made the windows rattle in their frames, and by 10 o'clock, when the household had retired, the snow had begun. Not the soft, decorative snow of illustrations in children's books, but the kind that comes sideways and hard, and packs into every gap and crack it can find. By morning, the world outside had been completely rearranged. The drive was buried. The lane from the estate to the nearest village road was invisible, beneath a smooth white surface. The gateposts were half covered. The outbuildings had shapes on their roofs that bore no relation to their original lines. Owen Paris, who had risen before dawn as always, had gone as far as the first gate, and come back to report that the road was impassable, and would remain so for at least 3 days, possibly 4. The estate was, in the most complete sense, cut off. Clara stood at the window of her room in the early morning light, and looked at the transformed landscape. She had grown up with New York winters, which were cold and wet and uncomfortable in their own way. She had not grown up with this. The moors, which she was beginning to understand as a landscape in their usual state, had entirely disappeared. Where there had been rolling moorland and bare trees, and stone walls had been replaced by a smooth, enormous white silence that went all the way to the sky. She found it, unexpectedly, beautiful. She dressed and went downstairs to find that the household had already moved into a different mode of operation. Agnes was taking stock of the larder, which was well supplied. Mrs. Ellison was organizing the household around the fireplaces that would need to be kept burning. Percy and the other footman, a man named Arthur Gill, were carrying extra wood in from the store outside, before the path became fully buried. Owen Paris was nowhere inside, which meant he was somewhere outside doing something necessary. Edward was in the dining room with George Alderton, who had apparently been at the hall the previous evening for a meeting, and had stayed the night when the storm became clear. They were bent over a map of the estate, discussing the outbuildings and the tenant farms, and what might need attention. Clara looked at the scene and assessed it. She went to the kitchen and helped Agnes take the larder inventory, because 4 extra hands on a clear task were better than 2. The first day of being snowbound passed in purposeful activity. There was always something to do when you were cut off from the world. Things got fixed and sorted and addressed that had been left waiting for a less urgent moment. By the afternoon, the atmosphere in the house had shifted from something tense and formal to something more practical and, in a strange way, more human. George Alderton went home the afternoon of the second day, when Owen had cleared a narrow path to the road, and the conditions were passable on foot, though not by carriage, which left, in Ashmore Hall, Edward, Clara, Mrs. Ellison, Agnes, Percy, Arthur, Nora Finch, and Owen, who came in for meals, but otherwise spent his time managing the outdoor situation. And with George gone, the buffer that the estate's daily business had provided between Edward and Clara was gone too. On the second evening of the storm, Clara came to the dining room for dinner, and found that Percy had, either by instruction or initiative, set the table so that 2 places were laid at the same end. Not 20 feet apart, side by side, with reasonable space between them, at the nearer end of the long table. She sat down without commenting on it. Edward came in a few minutes later and stopped for just a moment when he saw the arrangement. Then he sat down. Percy served them with his usual quiet care, and then withdrew, because Percy had learned, in his 2 months at Ashmore Hall, when his presence was and was not useful. They ate for a few minutes in silence. Then Edward said, not to anyone in particular, the East Tenant farm will need roof work in the spring. The snow will have shifted a section of the roof that was already unstable. George mentioned that farm, Clara said. He said it has been empty for a year and a half. 18 months, Edward confirmed. What does it need to attract tenants? She asked. He looked at her. It was, she thought, the first time he had looked directly at her at a meal, without looking away, almost immediately. Roof work, he said. And the well needs relining. The family before last had a problem with the water. Those are fixable things, Clara said. They require capital, he said. The kitchen garden will reduce the household food expenditure by 1/3 next year, she said. Agnes estimated it. If we time the spring planting right, by summer, we are spending considerably less on fresh vegetables, which is a small amount, but it compounds. And the north pasture, once the drainage is done, has 4 acres that have been underproducing for years. Edward was quiet for a moment. You have been calculating the estate's small improvements, he said. I am trying to understand how the numbers work, she said. You told me the estate needs capital. The most direct path is not just one large action. It is many small savings and small improvements that accumulate. He was quiet for a long time after this. Agnes had sent up a roast chicken with potatoes, and they ate it in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which Clara noted with interest. I owned a dog when I was 7 years old, he said, a working sheepdog, given to me by a tenant on my father's estate. I called him Captain, because I was 7, and thought that was a distinguished name. What happened to him? She asked. He lived until I was 16, Edward said. He was the first thing I was ever responsible for. My father did not believe in indulging children emotionally, so he was officially the estate's working dog, but everyone knew he was mine. Your father sounds like a complicated man, she said. My father was a man who believed that the way to run an estate and a family was the same way, Edward said, by rules and by order, and by not allowing sentiment to influence decisions. There was a pause. And you agree with him, Clara said. It was not quite a question. I agreed with the principle, Edward said. I have had reason, over the years, to question whether the method was the only one. Clara put down her fork. She looked at him. Edward was looking at his glass. He was not, she thought, a man who often said things like what he had just said. He had the look of someone who had started speaking and was now slightly surprised to find himself still going. Margaret, he said, and stopped. Clara did not move. She did not speak. She understood, in a way she could not have explained, that this moment required only listening. Margaret found the rules of this house very difficult, Edward said, in the beginning. A pause. She was a lively person, the kind of person who made a room feel warmer just by being in it. I had not grown up around people like that. He turned his glass on the table. I told myself that the way the house was run was necessary. that the rules were for good reason, that she would understand them once she had settled in. He stopped. The fire in the dining room was burning low, and Percy had not come to add wood, because Percy had very good instincts. She was a kind woman, Edward said. She never once argued. She adapted to every requirement I placed on her. He stopped again. I have spent a great deal of years wondering whether, if she had argued, if she had pushed back, if she had been the kind of person who put a list of rules on a side table and called it under consideration, whether she would have been happier, whether I would have known her better. The room was very quiet. Clara looked at the man across the table from her. He was looking at his glass, turned sideways from her, and his profile in the firelight was set and still, and held something in it that was as close to honest truth as she imagined he was capable of offering. I think, she said carefully, that you are trying to answer a question about the past, that the past cannot answer, and I think that asking yourself what you should have done differently is only useful if it changes what you do from here. He looked at her. You are very direct, he said. I have been told, she said. Is that what made you leave New York? She looked at him. He had surprised her. Partly, she said. That and a headmaster who dismissed me for disagreeing with him, and then quietly made it difficult to find another teaching position. On what did you disagree? On whether children deserved a proper education about the world they actually lived in, she said. He was quiet for a moment. And you felt England offered better conditions? I felt England offered different ones, she said. And I was out of options in New York. She had not quite intended to say that last part. It was true, but it was more honest than she usually allowed herself to be in early conversation. She waited to see what he would do with it. He nodded, just once, slowly. I understand the appeal of different conditions, he said. They sat for a few more minutes. Agnes sent up a pudding with Percy, who came and went with the efficiency of someone who had a sense for timing. They ate it in a silence that was, by now, considerably different from the silence they had shared at this table 10 days earlier. When the meal was over and they were standing in the corridor, Clara said, simply, "Thank you for telling me about Margaret." Edward looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked at her. "Good night, Clara," he said. He had not used her name before. He had been calling her Miss Voss, or not calling her anything at all. She felt the difference of it, small and significant. "Good night, Edward," she said. She went upstairs. He stood in the corridor for a moment, alone, and then went to his study. The fire there had been kept up. The room was warm. He sat in his chair and looked at the fire for a long time, not reading, not writing, not reviewing accounts, not doing the things he normally filled his evenings with, when he needed to feel that time was being used purposefully. He just sat. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. The moors were silent under their white covering. The stars, when they appeared through a gap in the clouds, were very bright in the way they can only be when the air is clean and cold and the world has been hushed. In the kitchen, Agnes was putting out the last of the lights and checking the stove, as she did every evening. She moved through the familiar routine with the ease of 30 years of practice. She paused at the window above the sink and looked out at the snow. Then she went to bed. In her room, Clara did not unpack more books or sit in the chair by the window. She simply lay down, looked at the dark ceiling, and thought about what had happened at that table tonight, with the same careful attention she gave to everything. She thought about a man who had ruled his house with quiet iron for 7 years, and who had, over a dinner of roast chicken and potatoes during a snowstorm, spoken the name of his dead wife and the thing he regretted about her, and sat with it, instead of putting it away. She thought that this was perhaps the bravest thing she had seen anyone do in a very long time. She closed her eyes. She thought about tomorrow. She thought about how the house would be the same, and also different now, the way a room is different when a window has been opened in it, even after the window is closed again, because the air inside has changed. She slept, and outside, Ashmore Hall stood quiet in its white field, and the stars were very bright, and something had shifted in the air that no amount of snow could cover back over. The days after the snowstorm had a different texture than the ones before it. Nothing had been resolved. Nothing had been declared or decided. But something had shifted in the atmosphere of Ashmore Hall, the way the air shifts after a long rain, lighter and cleaner but not entirely clear. Edward and Clara did not become easy with each other. They were not the kind of people who could become easy quickly, and perhaps they were not the kind of people who would ever be easy in the ordinary sense. But the 20 feet of polished table between their dinner plates became 15, and then 10, and eventually they were eating at the same end, without any fanfare, the way it had been during the storm, because there was no good reason to eat at opposite ends of a room that was already too large. They talked, not about feelings, not about the things that had been said during the snowbound evenings. Those conversations existed in a kind of separate space, and neither of them rushed to revisit them. They talked about the estate, about the drainage project, about the kitchen garden plans that Clara had been developing with Agnes and Owen Paris, who turned out to have considerable knowledge of soil and planting that Clara found invaluable. They talked about the upcoming county social events, which were a subject that required negotiation. "The Whitmore dinner," Edward said one morning, looking at the calendar on his desk. "The 6th of January. We are expected." "Both of us?" Clara asked. "A duke does not attend a county dinner without his wife," Edward said. "It would raise questions." "I do not mind attending," Clara said. "I just want to understand what is expected." What was expected, Edward explained in the careful tones of someone conveying a set of social rules they found slightly absurd but necessary, was that Clara would be composed and pleasant, would allow herself to be introduced as the Duchess of Ashmore, would speak when spoken to and not more than was appropriate, and would not introduce subjects that were considered controversial in county society. Clara looked at him. "What subjects are considered controversial?" she asked. He listed several: land reform, the rights of women to vote, American social practices, the management of servants. Clara listened to all of them. Then she said, "I understand what you are telling me. I want to be clear that I will be polite and appropriate. I will not make the evening difficult for you. But if someone asks for my opinion, I will give it honestly, because anything else is dishonest, and I do not do it." Edward looked at her. "If someone asks for your opinion on land reform at the Whitmore dinner," he said, "I will need to be warned in advance." "If someone at the Whitmore dinner brings up land reform," Clara said, "I will be surprised enough by their courage that I will tell you about it immediately." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he went back to his calendar. Clara noticed, and stored carefully, that he had not told her to simply do as she was told. He had said he would need warning. That was a negotiation. It was the closest thing to humor she had heard from him in 30 days. The social events began in January, and were exactly as Clara had expected. The county's established families were polite, curious, and careful. They were not unkind. But they looked at Clara with the measured attention of people assessing something they were not sure about. She was American. She was not from an established family. She had not been part of any social world they recognized. She had been acquired, and they were deciding what that meant. Clara gave them very little to decide about. She was composed. She asked people questions about their own estates and families, because she had found that the fastest way to make people comfortable was to give them the opportunity to talk about themselves. She listened well. She laughed at the right moments. She was, by every measure the county would have applied, perfectly behaved. She also, at the Whitmore dinner, when seated next to a widowed baroness named Lady Catherine Morse, who turned out to have strong and well-reasoned opinions about the management of rural schools, had a 40-minute conversation that she found genuinely interesting, and that resulted in 2 letters being exchanged in the following weeks. Edward, observing from across the table, noticed something he had not anticipated. Clara was not simply enduring the social obligations. She was operating in them with a kind of fluid competence that was completely self-generated. She had not been trained in these rooms. She had not grown up in this world. She was applying her own intelligence to the situation and producing results that no amount of careful coaching could have achieved. Afterward, in the carriage on the way back to Ashmore Hall, he said, "Lady Catherine seemed very taken with you." "She is remarkable," Clara said. "She has been managing her late husband's estate for 12 years, on her own, and has increased the productivity of the tenants considerably, through a school she started for their children. She wants to expand it, and needs support from the county families." "She has never managed to get it," Edward said. "I noticed," Clara said. "I told her I would come and see the school." He looked at her. "You told her you would come." "Next Tuesday," Clara said. "I thought I might also speak to the children. About books and reading. I miss teaching. There was a pause in the carriage. The road back to Ashmore was dark and cold, and the horses moved steadily through it. I will have George arrange the carriage, Edward said. Clara looked at him. She had expected at least some hesitation. Thank you, she said. Lady Catherine is a capable woman, Edward said. If she needs support for the school, it would be appropriate for the estate to provide it. Clara understood that he was framing it as a practical decision rather than a personal one. She understood also that this was simply how he communicated, and that pushing him to frame things differently was not the point. I agree, she said. They arrived at Ashmore Hall. Edward handed her out of the carriage with the formal courtesy that was simply part of how he moved through physical space with other people. His hand was briefly on hers. They walked inside. In the entrance hall, the side table where Clara had placed the list of rules on her first day was visible in the lamplight. The list itself was long gone, moved somewhere or discarded, she was not sure. The table had a bowl of dried flowers on it now, which Clara had placed there in her third week. She had not asked permission. Edward had not commented on it. Good evening, he said, at the foot of the stairs. Good evening, she said. She went upstairs. He went to his study. She sat in her room and took off her evening shoes, which were impractical, and rubbed her feet, which always made her feel more like herself, and thought about the evening. She had been in England for 6 weeks. She had reorganized a library, reopened a kitchen garden, settled 2 wage disputes, attended 3 county dinners, and read approximately 200 pages of agricultural management writing. She had also had the most honest conversation of the past 5 years, during a snowstorm, with a man who had not voluntarily spoken to her in full sentences for the first 10 days of her time here. She thought about the East Wing. She had not seen Edward at the locked door again. She had not expected to, because whatever that hour of night was for him, it was private, and she had intruded on it once accidentally, and would not do so again on purpose. But she thought about it. She thought about what it meant to lock something away, because you could not find a way to process it. She understood it. She had her own locked things. She simply kept them in her mind, rather than in a room. But the principle was the same. The key in the drawer. The door that stayed closed. The thing you could not look at yet. She got into bed and lay in the dark. She thought about the carriage ride. The brief warmth of his hand. Not the warmth of attraction. Not yet. Not something she was ready to name. But the warmth of a person. Of contact between 2 human beings, who had been, for very different reasons, spending too much time alone. She thought about the conversation during the storm. What he had said about Margaret. What he had not said, but what she had understood. That he had spent 7 years blaming himself, quietly and without anyone to talk to, for not having known his wife better. She thought, for the first time, that there might be something here, beyond what the agency had arranged. Not the romance of novels, nothing that straightforward or that bright, but something quieter and more real. The possibility of 2 people who had each, in their own way, been shaped by difficulty, actually seeing each other. She was not certain about it. She was not the kind of person who became certain about things before the evidence was clear. But she thought it might be possible. Outside, the winter was settling in over the moors. The frost was making patterns on the window glass. The stars were out again, clear and cold and very far away. Clara closed her eyes and slept. In his study, Edward had done something he had not done in a long time. He had not reviewed accounts. He had not drafted letters. He had not gone through the household reports that George left for him on Fridays. He had simply sat, with a glass on the table beside him, and thought about the evening. He thought about Clara in the Whitmore dining room, holding that conversation with Lady Catherine with the ease of someone who had been doing this all her life, when she had in fact been doing it for 6 weeks. He thought about the drive home, and the dark road, and the brief moment of her hand under his when he helped her down. He thought about the fact that he had, without planning it, and without particularly wanting to, looked forward to dinner every evening for the past 2 weeks. He thought about this with the careful attention he gave to things that were changing, without his having authorized them to change. Then he did something he had not done since he was a very young man, in the first year of his marriage to Margaret, when the world still felt like something that might offer him good things. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk. He took out a small notebook. the kind he used for private observations, and which he had not written in for years. He uncapped his pen. He thought for a moment about what he wanted to write. Then he wrote this: "I believe I have been making a significant error, and I believe I know what it is." He looked at the sentence. He did not write anything more. He closed the notebook and put it back in the drawer and went to bed, and lay in the dark, and listened to the silence of the house that was, now, not entirely silent, because somewhere at the other end of the building, there was another person, breathing and thinking and being alive in it. He fell asleep faster than he usually did. In the morning, the frost was thick on every window, and Agnes made porridge with cream, and Owen Paris reported that the northern fence line had held through the cold, and that the groundwork for the kitchen garden beds was ready to be turned as soon as the temperature allowed. Clara heard this last piece of news at breakfast with the household staff and said, "Good, I want to be there when we start turning it." Owen looked at her. "You want to be there?" "I will not be in the way," she said. "I want to understand the process." Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Wear boots you do not mind ruining." "I have exactly those boots," Clara said. Percy, eating his porridge at the end of the table, had to look very carefully at his bowl for a moment to compose himself. Nora Finch did not bother composing herself. She smiled openly, and then caught Mrs. Ellison's eye, and looked back at her porridge. Mrs. Ellison did not look at her porridge. She looked, briefly, and with something that was difficult to interpret precisely, at the empty chair, at the far end of the table, where the Duke usually ate alone. Then she poured herself more tea, and went on with the morning. The winter deepened through January, and into February, and Ashmore Hall moved through the coldest months, in a rhythm that was, for the first time in years, not merely functional, but alive. Small things marked the difference. There were books on the side tables now, in rooms where side tables had previously held only dust and decorative objects. The kitchen was producing more than it needed, because Clara had asked Agnes to teach her certain recipes, and Agnes, who had strong opinions about how things should be done, had found this a thoroughly acceptable request, and had been teaching her every Thursday afternoon. The sounds of the house were different. There was conversation at meals. There was laughter in the kitchen, which was not new, exactly, because Agnes and her staff had always had their own warmth, but which now sometimes drifted through the door into the main corridor. Nora Finch, the youngest housemaid, who had spent her first 8 months at Ashmore walking carefully and speaking very little, was now moving through her work with the ease of someone who felt that the space she occupied was genuinely hers to be in. Percy had asked Mrs. Ellison whether he might borrow one of the books from the library's natural history section. Mrs. Ellison had said, with equal care, that she could not speak to that, but he might ask the Duchess. He had asked Clara. She had immediately gone to the shelf and pulled out 3 different volumes and asked which subjects he was most interested in. He had been so surprised by the offer that he had stared at her for a full 5 seconds before answering. He had left with 2 books and a recommendation for a third. These were the small things. They accumulated. Edward noticed them in the way he noticed most things, quietly, and without immediately saying anything. He was not a man who processed the world aloud, but he was observant, and what he observed across the weeks of that winter was that something was returning to Ashmore Hall that had been absent for a long time. Not loudness, not celebration, something quieter than that. Something that felt, in a way he could not have easily put into words, like what the place was supposed to feel like. He would not have said this to anyone, but he thought it more than once. His interactions with Clara had also changed. Not dramatically. He was not a man given to dramatic changes. But they had shifted from something edged and resistant to something that was, he had to admit to himself in the privacy of his study, genuinely interesting. She was intelligent in a way that was not decorative. She did not use her intelligence to impress people or to win arguments for the satisfaction of winning. She used it to solve problems. She asked questions until she understood something, and when she understood it, she connected it to 4 other things you had not thought of, and 2 of those connections were usually useful. He had started leaving the door of his study open in the evenings. He had not consciously decided to do this. He had simply noticed, one evening when Clara was in the library directly across the corridor, that the sound of someone else existing in the same part of the building was not, as he had assumed it would be, intrusive. It was, if he was being precise about it, a relief. He had been alone for a very long time. He had told himself that alone was manageable, that he had his work, and his routines, and his responsibilities, and that was sufficient. And it had been sufficient, in the sense that one can sustain oneself on very little, for a very long time, before one begins to properly feel the absence of everything else. The event that moved things forward in February came not through any planned conversation, but through an accident of timing and difficulty. Clara had been at Lady Catherine's school in the village every Tuesday since January, and the arrangements had settled into a routine. She would leave at 10, spend 3 hours at the school, and return by 2. On the second Tuesday of February, the carriage returned early, at 12:30, because one of the horses had gone lame on the road, and Owen had decided to bring her back rather than risk the animal further. Clara came in through the back door because it was closer, and found Edward in the corridor outside the kitchen, in a state she had never seen him in before. He was speaking quietly, but very quickly, to George Alderton, who was holding a letter, and his face had lost the composed control that was his usual expression. He looked pale. He looked deeply worried. She stopped. She was about to withdraw, because this was clearly a private moment, when Edward looked up and saw her. He paused, took a breath. "Forgive me," he said. "I was not aware you had returned." "The horse went lame," she said. "What has happened?" George looked at Edward. Edward was quiet for a moment, and she could see him deciding something. "The East Tenant Farm," he said. "There has been a fire. Not the building, it did not reach the building, but the grain store and part of the yard. The family that were interested in taking the tenancy were there this morning inspecting it, and they have withdrawn their interest." Clara looked at him. He was holding himself very straight, the way he did when he was pressing something down. "Is anyone hurt?" she asked. "No one was hurt," he said. "It was the cold. A brazier left too close to the grain store. An accident." "Then that can be fixed," she said. "The family was our best prospect in 2 years," he said. "I know," she said. "I know that matters. But right now, you look like someone who is about to make decisions in a state of alarm, and in my experience, those decisions almost always need to be reversed later, which is twice the work." He looked at her. George Alderton looked at his shoes. "Come and sit down," Clara said. "Let me read the letter. Tell me the full situation. Then we can work out what to do." There was a pause. It was the kind of pause where a man who has been running everything alone for years has to decide whether he will allow someone else into the problem. Edward handed her the letter. They went to the morning room. George came with them. Clara read the letter carefully. Then she asked 6 questions, specific practical questions, about the state of the farm, the cost of the repairs already outstanding, the damage to the grain store, and the timeline George believed was realistic for a new inspection. George answered all 6 with the precision of a man who appreciated being asked useful questions. "The grain store is the problem," Clara said. "It is what puts prospective tenants off. But if it were rebuilt before the next inspection, with a proper brick construction rather than timber, you would have something better than what was there before. You would be offering improved storage. That is an argument, not a liability." Edward was quiet for a moment. "The cost of rebuilding it in brick," he said. "How much is a viable tenant worth to this estate annually?" she asked. He told her. "Then the rebuild cost is recovered in under 2 years," she said. "And after that, it is pure benefit." George was writing in his notebook again. "I will get estimates this week," he said. Clara put the letter down. She looked at Edward, who had lost some of the pale tightness he had come in with. "You should eat something," she said. "Agnes made soup." He looked at her. Then he did something she had not seen him do before. He laughed. It was brief and quiet, more of an exhale of surprise than a proper laugh, but it was genuine. "I beg your pardon?" he said. "You have been standing in that corridor since what time?" she asked. "George arrived at 8, he said. "It is nearly 1 o'clock, she said. "Agnes made soup." He shook his head slightly, but there was something in his face that was not resistance. They went to the kitchen. Agnes, who had not been informed of the difficulty, and was therefore not hovering with sympathy, simply pointed at the table in her usual manner and put bowls in front of them. George ate with them. Percy appeared briefly and was sent to eat in the servants' hall with the quiet firmness of someone who understood this was not the moment for an audience. They ate. They talked through the farm situation, with the practical thoroughness of people working a problem rather than carrying it. George left at 2 with a list of tasks and a visible sense of purpose. Edward and Clara were left at the kitchen table with their second cups of tea. "You knew I had not eaten," he said. "Your face was the color of the East Wing corridor," she said. "That is usually hunger or distress." I assumed both. He looked at his tea. "You are very observant," he said. "I have been watching this house for 6 weeks," she said. "I notice things." A pause. "What else have you noticed?" he asked. There was something careful in the way he asked it, not a challenge, a genuine question. She thought about what she could say, and what would be too much, and where the line between the two was for this particular man, at this particular table. "I have noticed that you know this estate better than anyone else ever could," she said, "and that you care about it more than you let on. I have noticed that the staff respect you, which is different from being afraid of you, and I think they know the difference better than you do. I have noticed that you read very late most evenings, because your study light is on until past midnight, more nights than not." She paused. "I have noticed that since the storm, you seem slightly less like someone who has decided to be alone, and more like someone who had simply run out of other arrangements." He was quiet for a long time. "That is a great deal of noticing," he said. "You asked," she said. He nodded. Once, slowly. Then he looked at her directly, in the clear-eyed way he occasionally did when he had stopped managing the conversation and was simply in it. "I did ask," he said, and then, after a moment, "What would you like me to notice about you?" It was the most personal question he had ever asked her. She had not expected it, and she took a second to find her answer. "That I am trying," she said, "in good faith, to make something real out of this." He looked at her. "I know," he said. "I noticed that first." Outside the kitchen window, the winter afternoon was getting dark. Agnes was moving quietly in the background. The stove was warm. Clara finished her tea. Edward finished his. They sat for one more moment, in a silence that was, by now, entirely comfortable. And then they both got up and went back to the work of the day. But something had been added, quietly and without ceremony, to the account of what they were to each other. Not love yet, not even close to a declaration, but the kind of honest attention two people pay each other when they have stopped performing for the other's benefit and started simply being present. It was not a small thing. Outside, January was nearly done, and the days were beginning, almost imperceptibly, to lengthen. The frost on the window each morning was still deep and white, but the light behind it was, just slightly, changing. February moved steadily toward March. And in Ashmore Hall, which had been built on the principle that a house could hold everything tightly enough, if the rules were strict enough and the walls were thick enough, two people were quietly, stubbornly, without either of them having planned it, making room for each other. The month of March arrived with a change in the weather that felt, to everyone at Ashmore Hall, like something more than just a shift in temperature. The snow retreated from the moors. The ground began to soften. The days grew longer, in a way that was visible by the end of the first week. An extra quarter hour of light in the evening that made the windows on the west side of the house glow for longer before dark arrived. Owen Paris and his 2 young helpers began turning the kitchen garden. They worked methodically through the raised beds, clearing the old growth and turning the soil, and the smell of it, clean earth and the iron of wet stone, drifted up through the windows that Clara had taken to leaving open in the afternoons. She stood at her window one morning in the second week of March and watched Owen work, and felt something shift inside her that she recognized, after a moment, as belonging. Not ownership, not possession, something quieter and more durable. The feeling of a place becoming, slowly and without announcement, yours. She had been at Ashmore Hall for 4 months. She thought about that. 4 months ago she had crossed an ocean with 2 trunks and a crate of books, and arrived in a house that felt like it had been built to keep feeling out. She had placed a list of rules on a side table and told herself she was simply being practical. She had not told herself she would come to care about any of this. She had not prepared for that. She had prepared to be independent and effective and to make a functional arrangement work on her own terms. She had not prepared to be moved by the sight of an overgrown garden being brought back to life, or to feel something she could not easily name when she heard Agnes laugh in the kitchen, or to find herself in the evenings genuinely looking forward to whatever conversation might happen over dinner. She and Edward had dinner together every evening now. Not by formal arrangement. It had simply become what happened. They talked. Sometimes about the estate. Sometimes about books, which had become a genuine shared ground. Because Edward read enormously, and his taste was serious and broad. And when he disagreed with Clara about something he had read, he disagreed with precision, and it made the conversation more interesting rather than less. He had read 3 of the books from her crate, which she had noticed because she knew where all her books were, and she noticed when they were not in their places. She had not said anything about it. She had simply, one evening, mentioned something from one of those books, and watched his face for a reaction. "You read my copy of the Garrison Essays," she said one evening. He paused. "I borrowed it," he said, "from your shelf." "You should have asked," she said. "You would have said yes," he said. "I would," she said. "But you still should have asked." He looked at her with the expression he wore when she was right about something he found mildly inconvenient. "What did you think of the 3rd essay?" he asked. And they had talked about that for the better part of an hour. This was the texture of things now. Back and forth, give and take, 2 people finding the edges of each other's thinking, and testing them with curiosity rather than resistance. Clara had not known what to expect from this kind of arrangement. She had known it would not be easy. She had not expected it to be interesting. The event that changed the temperature of the county's view of the Duke and his new wife came on a Saturday in mid-March, at a dinner hosted by a local lord named Sir Philip Cavendish, a man of 60 with strong opinions about the proper order of things and a long memory for perceived insults. Sir Philip had been among the most visibly skeptical of the county families regarding Clara. He had said very little at the events where they had encountered each other, but his silences were pointed ones, and his wife, a precise woman named Dorothy, had treated Clara with a politeness so measured it was almost an art form. At his dinner in March, with 14 guests at the table, Sir Philip had consumed somewhat more wine than was advisable, and had made a remark, addressed to the man next to him but pitched to Carrie, to the effect that it was remarkable what some men would accept as adequate in the absence of better options, by which he clearly meant Clara. The table had gone quiet, in the specific way tables go quiet when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Edward, at the far end of the table, had looked up. Clara had been watching him for 4 months. She knew his expressions with a precision she had not expected to develop. She saw, in his face in that moment, something happen that was fast and clear. Not anger, not exactly. Something colder than anger. Something that had made a decision. He set down his glass. He looked at Sir Philip. "I am sorry," he said, in the quiet, carrying tone of a man who does not need to raise his voice to be heard. "I am not sure I followed your meaning." Sir Philip, who had perhaps not expected a response, looked slightly uncomfortable. "I was simply remarking," he said, "on the nature of modern arrangements. My wife," Edward said, clearly and without hurry, "has improved this estate materially in 4 months. She has a sharper mind than most of the men in this room, and the practical intelligence to do something with it. If you have a specific objection to her character, I would be glad to hear it directly. Otherwise, I would ask that remarks about my household be kept until you are in a room where I am not present, which should allow you rather more freedom." The silence that followed was absolute. Sir Philip opened his mouth, then he closed it. Dorothy Cavendish looked at her plate. Edward picked up his glass and took a sip as though nothing had happened. Clara, across the table from him, was looking at her own plate. She was aware that every other person at the table was watching one of them, or both of them, or the space between them. She kept her expression perfectly neutral. Inside, something had happened that she had not prepared for. He had done that without being asked, without any discussion, without any preparation. He had simply, in the plainest and most direct language he was capable of, told the room who she was to him. The dinner ended somewhat earlier than planned. The carriage ride home was quiet for the first few minutes. Clara looked at the dark road. Edward looked at his hands. "You did not have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "I am perfectly capable of handling remarks like that myself," she said. "I know that too," he said. A pause. "But you did it anyway," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the road now, not at her. "Why?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Because it was true," he said. "Everything I said was true." and he should have known it. She sat with that. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. Just once. They arrived at Ashmore Hall. He handed her down from the carriage. The same formal gesture it always was, except that tonight, his hand held hers for perhaps 2 seconds longer than strictly necessary. They went inside. In the entrance hall, the bowl of dried flowers was on the side table, and the lamps were lit, and the house was warm. Clara went upstairs and sat in her room for a long time, not reading, not thinking in the structured way she normally thought, just sitting with everything that had happened, and everything it meant. She thought about the word that had been forming quietly in the back of her mind for several weeks, and that she had been carefully not looking at directly, the way you do not look directly at something bright. She was beginning to love him. Not the love of novels, not the sudden certain feeling that people wrote about in poems, something more gradual and more honest than that, something built from watching a person choose, again and again, to be better than their instincts required them to be, from hearing a man tell the truth about his grief in the dark, and then get up the next morning and manage his estate, from finding, in someone who had every reason to be entirely closed, a person who was, slowly, choosing to be open. She was not going to say any of this, not yet. But she noted it. She went to bed. Downstairs, in his study, Edward sat with the fire and thought about what he had said at the Cavendish dinner, and whether it had been the right thing to do, and found, somewhat to his surprise, that he had no doubt about it at all. He pulled out the private notebook from his desk drawer. He opened it to the page where he had written the sentence about making a significant error. Beneath it, he wrote a second sentence. He looked at what he had written, then he closed the notebook carefully and put it back. Outside, the March wind came across the moors, warmer than it had been, carrying with it the smell of wet earth and the particular freshness of a season beginning to change. In the east wing corridor, the locked door stood as it always had, but the key was in the drawer in Edward's study, and he had been opening that drawer slightly more often lately, not to take the key out, not yet, but to look at it, which was, for a man like Edward, a significant thing. The county spoke about the Cavendish dinner for 2 weeks afterward. Dorothy Cavendish wrote a carefully worded letter to Clara that said, in essence and beneath much polite language, that she had found her husband's remark regrettable. Clara wrote back with equal care and considerably less hidden meaning, and found the exchange oddly satisfying. Edward's standing in the county had, if anything, improved. A man defending his wife in public was, in that world, seen as admirable. Clara did not resent this. She simply noted it as one more example of how the world worked and moved forward. What she focused on more was what had happened between them in that carriage, in the dark, on the road back through the moors, where Edward had been honest, without anyone asking him to be. That, she thought, was worth more than any amount of public gestures. It was worth more because it had cost him something. And in Ashmore Hall, on the night after the Cavendish dinner, the household slept, and the moors were dark and wide, and the stars were very bright. And somewhere in the north of England, in a house that had been cold for 7 years, something very quietly, and very certainly, was beginning to warm. April arrived at Ashmore Hall with green things. The kitchen garden, which Clara and Owen and Agnes had been planning since December, began to produce the first visible signs of something happening beneath the surface. The early rows of leeks and spinach sent up their tentative green, and Clara would check them in the mornings with a pleasure she made no attempt to disguise. Owen, who was not a man of many words, had begun offering his observations without being asked, which Clara had come to understand was his version of enthusiasm. She had been at Ashmore Hall for 5 months. The county had shifted in its attitude toward her, slowly, and without any single moment that could be pinpointed as the cause. She had received 2 letters in the week following the Cavendish dinner, from women of the county who had never previously written to her. Edward's standing had, if anything, improved. She noted this without resentment, moved on, and focused instead on what was actually changing between herself and the man she had married. His attention had changed. He looked at her differently, not with any particular emotion she could easily name, but with a kind of directness that had not been there in the first months. When she spoke, he listened with the full attention of someone who had decided that what was being said mattered. When they disagreed, which still happened regularly, the disagreement had a different quality, sharper in some ways, but without the resistance of before. He had also, quietly, opened the east wing door. She had not been present when it happened. She knew only that one morning in the third week of April, she had been walking through the connecting corridor to retrieve a shawl she had left in the morning room, and the door at the end of the east wing corridor, which had been locked every single day she had been in this house, was standing open. She had stopped. She had looked at the open door for a long moment. She had not gone through it. She had gone to get her shawl and come back the same way, and the door was still open. She did not say anything about it. She waited. 2 days later, Edward appeared in the library doorway in the evening, where she was reading, and said, "I would like to show you something." She put down her book. He led her to the east wing. The corridor was dim. The air was colder than the rest of the house. He had the key in his hand, which she noted, and the door at the end was open, as it had been for the past 2 days. They went through it. The room beyond was large. The windows faced south and east, which meant that in the mornings and early afternoons, it would be full of light. It had been full of light once, she could see that. There were white drapes over the furniture, which was the kind of furniture that suggested someone had lived here, really lived here, with bookshelves of their own, and chairs arranged near the window, and a writing table angled to catch the best of the morning sun. The wallpaper was pale yellow with a thin floral pattern that had faded but still suggested warmth. It was a room that had once been very much alive. Edward stood in the middle of it and looked at it the way she had seen him look at certain account numbers, with a kind of steady attention that was holding something at bay. She chose this room herself, he said. She liked the morning light. She said it was the most cheerful part of the house. Clara stood beside him and looked at the room. "It is," she said. It was true. "I kept it closed because," he began, and then stopped. "I told myself it was because I did not know what to do with it, that there was no purpose for it." He was quiet. "But I think the honest answer is that it was easier to keep it closed than to come in here and acknowledge that time has passed, and that closing a room does not stop it." Clara looked at him. "What would you like to do with it?" she asked. He turned to look at her. He had clearly been preparing for a different kind of response. The question caught him slightly off guard. "I do not know," he said. "That is why I wanted to show it to you." She looked around the room. The light at this hour, late afternoon, came in from the west windows of the corridor behind them, slanting into the doorway and across the floor. "I think it should be used," she said. "I think a room like this should not be in the dark." "Yes," he said. "I will not do anything with it without your agreement," she said. "Every decision about this room is yours. But when you are ready, I have ideas." He nodded. They stood there for another few minutes, not talking, just standing in the room with the white-covered furniture, and the faded yellow walls, and the particular quality of a space that has been holding its breath for a long time. Then Edward reached out and took one of the white drapes between his fingers and pulled it slowly off the chair it covered. The chair beneath was a small armchair, covered in pale green fabric, with wooden arms. He looked at it for a moment, then he folded the drape and set it carefully on the floor. Clara understood that this was the most significant thing she had seen him do since she had arrived. She did not comment on it. She simply stood with him in the room while the light changed around them, and after a while they went back to the main part of the house, and the door of the east wing remained open behind them as they walked away. That evening, near the end of dinner, Edward said, "Your school visits. Lady Catherine mentioned in a letter to me that the children look forward to Tuesdays." Clara looked at him. "She wrote to you?" "She wrote to thank me," he said, "for allowing you to come. I found it curious phrasing, as though I had given permission." "I did not ask permission," Clara said. "I know," he said. "I told her so. I told her you do not ask permission. You inform, which is different, and that I had found it consistently preferable to either of the alternatives." Clara sat with this for a moment. "That is possibly the most generous thing you have ever said about me," she said. "It was accurate," he said. She smiled. She had smiled in this room before, but not quite like this, not with the ease of someone who is not managing the conversation, but simply in it. He looked at her smile. He looked at it for exactly the length of time that a man looks at something he had not quite admitted to himself he had been waiting to see. Then he looked back at his plate. Clara picked up her glass. The evening finished. They parted at the foot of the stairs. the way they always did. But tonight, before they turned their separate ways, Edward said, very simply, "Good night, Clara." And she said, "Good night, Edward." And there was something in both their voices that was slightly different from the way that exchange had sounded 3 months ago, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so, and they both went to their separate rooms, and that was how the evening ended. But it had been something. In the morning, when the first clear sunlight of spring came through the east wing windows and lay across the pale green armchair that no longer had a white drape over it, the room looked different. It looked like a room waiting to be lived in again, rather than a room being kept as a memorial. There is a difference between those two things. It is the difference between grief that preserves and grief that releases. Edward had spent 7 years in the first kind. He was, very slowly, beginning to move into the second. Clara, standing in the corridor that morning on her way to breakfast, saw the light coming through the open east wing door and paused for just a moment, looking at it. Then she went downstairs because Agnes had told her yesterday that Tuesday mornings were when she made the dough for the week's bread, and Clara had asked if she could help, and Agnes had said yes, with the tone of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by anything this American woman did. Owen Paris was already in the kitchen when Clara came through the door, boots in hand, ready to report on the kitchen garden before the day started. He looked up when she came in, nodded, and said 3 words that were, for him, practically a speech. "Spinach is up," he said. Clara sat down, put on her boots, and smiled. Spring had arrived, and in Ashmore Hall, something very much like the same. The formal matter of their marriage had been, from the start, a contract. Clara and Edward had both known this, and had both, in their separate ways, been relatively comfortable with the clarity of it. A contract was honest. A contract said what it was. But by the end of April, when the kitchen garden was properly green, and the north pasture drainage work was underway, and the east tenant farm had its new grain store under construction, it had become apparent to anyone paying attention, and everyone in Ashmore Hall paid attention, that whatever existed between the Duke and his wife was no longer simply contractual. It was not simple at all, of course. It was 2 people who had each spent years building very careful walls, who had arrived at this arrangement from places of loss and difficulty, who had different habits of mind, and different rhythms, and different ways of being in the world. None of that disappeared because a snowstorm had produced honest conversation, or because a door had been opened. But something was there. The household felt it. Agnes had begun, without any particular announcement, making dinner slightly more considered than the estate's usual menus. Not extravagant, just thoughtful. The way a person prepares food when they think the people eating it deserve something more than merely sufficient. Mrs. Ellison had quietly restocked the guest linen in a manner that suggested she was thinking ahead. Percy had stopped bracing himself whenever he entered a room that both Edward and Clara were in, because the energy between them was no longer a thing he needed to navigate around. Clara noticed all of this. She also noticed that she had stopped thinking about Ashmore Hall as a place she had arrived at, and started thinking about it as a place she lived. The distinction was small and significant. She had also, somewhere in the past month, stopped thinking about Edward as a problem to be solved, and started simply thinking about him, the way you think about someone who occupies the same space as you, in a way that matters. In the first week of May, they had a conversation that changed things. It was not a planned conversation. They were in the East Wing room, which Clara had slowly been working on, removing the white drapes from the furniture, and cleaning the windows, and replacing the burned-out candles in the sconces with new ones. Edward had been there twice while she was working, standing in the doorway first, and then, gradually, coming inside and sitting in the pale green armchair while she worked. He did not help, he simply sat there. She thought he was learning how to be in the room again. On this particular afternoon, he had come with a letter in his hand and a look on his face that she had learned to identify as something he needed to say, but was still deciding how. She was sorting through a small pile of books that had been left in the room, several of them with notes in a distinctly feminine hand in the margins. Margaret's books. She had found them, and was looking at them with the careful attention of someone handling something that belonged to someone else. She annotated her books, Clara said, when Edward came into the room. "Yes," he said. She held one out to him. "Do you want to keep them here, or would you prefer them somewhere else?" He crossed the room, and took the book from her hands. He looked at the cover, then opened it, and looked at the annotation on the first page. He stood there for a moment, very still. She was very funny, he said. Her comments in the margins were almost always funny. She had a quick sense of humor, quicker than mine. What was she writing about? Clara asked. He showed her the annotation. It was a note about a particularly self-important passage of historical writing. 2 words that elegantly and precisely deflated it. Clara read it, and felt the humor of it immediately. She was right, Clara said. She usually was, Edward said. He closed the book. He held it for a moment, then set it carefully on the shelf. I think these should stay here, he said. This room should have books. Clara nodded. I will bring some of mine. He looked at her. I owe you an acknowledgement, he said. Something I should have said before. She turned to face him. When you arrived, he said, I gave you a list of rules and expected you to follow them. I did not ask what you were capable of, or what you wanted, or what kind of person you were. I had decided who I needed, and I tried to fit you into that shape. He paused. It was not a fair way to begin. Clara looked at him. No, she said. It was not, but I did not come here entirely honestly either. I agreed to terms I never intended to follow. I know, he said. I worked that out within about a week. And you were angry, she said. I was alarmed, he said, which I expressed as anger, which is a habit I apparently have. She studied him. Why alarmed? He was quiet for a moment. Because I could see, almost immediately, that you were a person, he said. Not a function or an arrangement. An actual person. And I had come to believe, over the past 7 years, that persons were not something I could safely have in my life. They could not be managed the way an estate can be managed. They changed the terms without notice. They made you feel things you had not planned to feel. Clara said nothing. She waited. I was wrong, he said, about what I could manage, and I was wrong about what I wanted. She took a breath. What do you want? She asked. He looked at her with the directness he had when he was not managing himself. This, he said. This is what I want. The way things are now. The way you are in this house. The conversations at dinner. The way I know where to find you at any given time of day, because you have made a pattern here that I have come to rely on without intending to. Clara held his gaze. That is not a complete answer, she said, gently. No, he said, it is not. He took a step toward her. Not much. Just one step, the kind of step a careful man takes when he is being honest about something and is not entirely sure of the ground. I do not know how to say this in a way that does not sound somewhat absurd, he said, given the arrangement we began with, and the fact that you put my list of rules on a side table on the first day. Go ahead, she said. I love you, he said, or I am, at minimum, substantially on the way to it, which at this stage of my life amounts to the same thing. Clara looked at him. She felt the full weight of those words, and what it had cost him to say them. A man who did not say things lightly, who had spent 7 years not saying anything personal at all, standing in the room he had kept locked for all that time, and offering the most personal thing he had. She crossed the distance between them. She took his face in both her hands, which was not the expected gesture, not the polite gesture, but the true one, the one that said exactly what she meant, and she looked at him for a moment. This careful, wounded, quietly trying man, who had given her a list of rules and then, piece by piece, undone every one of them. I know, she said. I have been watching you love me for quite some time. I was waiting for you to notice. He looked at her. Something in his face did what faces do when a long-held tension finally finds somewhere to go. He put his hands over hers. They stood like that in the East Wing room, with the morning light coming through the cleaned windows, and Margaret's annotated books on the shelf, and the pale green armchair, and the yellow wallpaper that had faded, but not disappeared, and something that had been waiting a long time to happen, simply happened. It was not a dramatic moment, it was a quiet one, the kind of moment that is most real, precisely because it does not perform itself. Outside, in the kitchen garden, Owen Paris was staking the earliest tomato plants and talking to his young assistant about the proper depth for a stake in loose spring soil. In the kitchen, Agnes was making bread, and the smell of it was moving through the ground floor of the house. The East Wing room was full of light, and in Ashmore Hall, which had been designed to keep things contained, something was finally free. That evening, they came to dinner together and sat down at the same end of the table, the way they always did now, and Percy served them, and they talked about the North Pasture, and about a book Clara had been reading, and about the letter that had come from the East Tenant Farm's prospective new family, expressing serious interest in the property. And if Percy noticed that there was something different about the space between them at the table that evening, something settled and easy and unhurried, he did not mention it to anyone. He mentioned it to Nora. Nora told him she had noticed the same thing 2 weeks ago, and that she had been waiting for him to catch up. Percy said that was not fair. Nora agreed that it was not, and they both went back to their work, and the house was full of the smell of bread, and the evening was full of light, and somewhere upstairs, in a room that was no longer locked, the pale green armchair sat in the last of the afternoon sun, and it was the most ordinary and extraordinary thing in the world. The marriage that had begun as a contract became, in the summer of 1890, something considerably more complicated and considerably more genuine. They did not announce it. There was nothing to announce. It was simply present in the way they moved through the house together now, in the directness of the conversations, in the absence of the careful management they had each previously applied to every interaction. The household did not comment. The household had been hoping for this for months, and was collectively wise enough to keep quiet about it. The formal gathering they had in the drawing room in late May was small, just the household staff and George Alderton, at which Edward made a toast in language that was, for him, remarkably plain. He said that he had married a woman who had made him better at his own life, and he was grateful for it, and he intended to spend the foreseeable future attempting to deserve it. Clara, who had been watching him, with the expression of someone witnessing a person do something genuinely difficult and getting it right, simply raised her glass. Agnes quietly stepped away for a moment. Percy noticed and said nothing until later. George Alderton shook Edward's hand, with the force of a man who had waited 12 years for this, and was not going to waste the moment on subtlety. Life at Ashmore Hall in the months that followed was not without friction, because Clara and Edward were both people with opinions, and neither of them had been changed by love into people without opinions. They disagreed regularly. They argued sometimes, in the specific way two intelligent people argue when they are not trying to win but to think. There were evenings when one of them was sharp and the other patient, and evenings when the roles reversed. There were decisions they made jointly that worked out well, and decisions that worked out less well, and they were equally honest about which was which. The East Tenant Farm was rebuilt and found new tenants by late summer. The family, a husband and wife with 3 children, took the improved grain store and the relined well and the repaired roof, and wrote a letter of thanks that Edward read twice before placing it on his desk where he could see it. The North Pasture drainage work was completed in June. The improvement to the yield was visible by the end of August. Lady Catherine's school expanded. Clara was now spending 2 days a week there, not just teaching, but helping to organize the curriculum, and, through contacts she had made in the county, finding additional books for the school's small library. Lady Catherine had become a genuine friend, one of the few Clara had made in England, and their correspondence was frequent and substantive and made Clara feel connected to a world of thinking beyond the estate's daily concerns. Edward found this entirely appropriate and said so. He had also, quietly, arranged for a small financial contribution from the Ashmore estate to the school, which Lady Catherine had accepted with the dignity of someone who knew when to take what was offered and not make too much of it. Mrs. Ellison had her 19th year at Ashmore Hall acknowledged with a dinner, which had been Clara's idea and which Edward had organized with more care than he typically gave to social arrangements. Agnes made the best dinner the house had seen in many years. Mrs. Ellison sat at the top of the table, and was served rather than serving, and did so with the quiet composure of someone who had not expected it, but was very glad of it. Percy was promoted. He became the under-butler, which was not a grand position, but was a recognition that he had earned. He used his book-borrowing arrangements freely, and discussed what he read with Clara at every opportunity, and occasionally with Edward, who had opinions about natural history that were more extensive than Percy had expected. Nora Finch had asked Mrs. Ellison about training for more senior duties. Mrs. Ellison had said yes, and Nora moved forward, steadily and without fanfare, the way people do when they have been given the space they needed all along. Owen Paris harvested the kitchen garden in September, and what came out of it was more than Agnes had estimated, and exactly what Clara had hoped for. They ate from it every day through the autumn. The surplus was distributed to the estate's tenants, which had been Clara's suggestion, and which Edward had immediately agreed to without making it seem like an agreement. On a Saturday evening in October, more than a year after Clara had arrived at Ashmore Hall with her 2 trunks and her crate of books, she and Edward sat together in the East Wing room, which now had no white drapes over anything, and which had been filled with a mixture of her books and his books, and Margaret's annotated volumes, arranged on the shelves together in the system Clara had established in the main library, which everyone now used without any reference to who had invented it. The fire was lit. The pale green armchair had been joined by a second chair, and they were sitting in both of them with a lamp between them and their respective books. Clara looked up from hers. "I have been thinking about the West Wing roof," she said. Edward, who had been deeply engaged in a volume on agricultural law, looked up with the expression of someone returning from considerable mental distance. "The West Wing roof," he said. "We have been patching it for 2 years," she said. "The autumn rains are starting. We need to decide whether to patch it again or do the full replacement this winter. The cost is substantial," he said. "The long-term cost of not doing it is more substantial," she said. He looked at her. "You have done the numbers," he said. "George and I went through them this week," she said. "I was going to mention it at dinner, but you were occupied with the land survey." He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man who was about to agree with something and was making peace with it. "Fine," he said. "Let us do the full replacement." "Good," she said, and went back to her book. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he went back to his own book. Outside, the autumn wind was moving over the moors in the particular way it did in October, restless and low, and carrying the smell of coming rain. The fire moved in the grate. The books were on the shelves. The lamp between them made a warm circle in the room. This room, which had been locked for 7 years, which had held its breath and its grief and its kept silence, was alive. Edward put his book down. "Clara," he said. She looked up. He looked at her with the direct, clear expression he had when he was about to say something true. "I am glad you came," he said. "I am glad you were not what I expected." She looked at him. "I knew what I was doing," she said. "I just did not tell the agency." He looked at her steadily. "You knew from the advertisement that you were going to disregard the terms?" "I knew from the advertisement," she said, "that whoever had written it needed someone who would not follow instructions, but would not say so directly." He was quiet for a moment. "That is a very confident interpretation," he said. "It was accurate," she said. He shook his head slightly. But there was something in his face that was entirely warm. "It was," he said. He picked up his book, she picked up hers. Between them, the lamp burned steadily. In the kitchen below, Agnes Park was finishing the last of the evening's work, and humming something quiet to herself, in the way she did when the day had been good. In the yard, Owen Paris had put the kitchen garden to bed for the winter, the beds turned over and covered, waiting for spring. Percy was in the servants' hall reading by his own lamp, turning pages with the careful enthusiasm of someone who has recently discovered how much world a book can hold. And in Ashmore Hall, which had been built by people who believed stone walls could hold anything in or out, 2 people who had arrived at each other by the most unlikely of arrangements were sitting in the room that had once been kept locked, reading, together, in the light. The agreement Clara had written to the matrimonial agency had said she was practical and direct. She was both of those things. She had not mentioned that she was also, in a way she had never quite managed to explain to anyone, the kind of person who could see what was needed in a situation and go toward it without flinching. The Duke of Ashmore had sent for an obedient wife. What he had received, instead, was the thing he most needed and had least expected, a person who was completely and irreversibly herself, and who had decided, on a cold November morning, to walk into a locked house and open every door she found. She had not asked permission. She had not needed it. She never had.